Hi, welcome to DEFCON 3. I'm KT McFarland. Do you know that game, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? Well, there's a new version of it, and it's Where in the World is President Yanukovych. The Iranian president has not been seen for nearly a week, but he emerged today in Russia, of all places, and here's what he had to say.
Russia has the right to act. I think that Russia has to and must act, and knowing the character of Mr. Putin, I'm surprised at the fact that he is still so reserved and keeping silent.
Well, that's Yanukovych. Secretary of State John Kerry responded.
We believe National Security Advisor Rice has made it very clear, and I've made it clear, that intervention would, in our judgment, be a very grave mistake. It would be completely contrary to Russian policies, as stated now, with respect to Libya, Syria, other places. Any acts, the question is whether or not what is happening now might be crossing a line in any way, and we're going to be very careful in making our judgments about that.
Well, we've heard now from President Yanukovych, we've heard from Secretary of State Kerry, but the one guy we haven't heard from is President Putin of Russia. But maybe we have heard from him. And that's why we brought in Colonel Cedric Leighton from Washington. He's a former strategic analyst for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I want to ask you, have we heard from Putin? I mean, he's got 150,000 troops that have just been mobilized on the Ukrainian border.
That's right, KT, and that's his message. He's basically saying, okay, if you go ahead and revolt Ukraine, here's what I'm going to do. And he may be looking at this in a way where he has plans to take over the entire country or just portions of the country. My guess is that he is looking at the possibility of taking over the eastern portion, especially the northeastern portion of the country, and the Crimea, because those areas have a significant Russian population. Basically, over 90% of the people in those areas, in some cases approaching 100%, are ethnic Russians, and that's what he's seeking to protect. It's a very nationalistic, very ethnocentric type way of looking at how to deploy your forces, and he's using his troops, his 150,000 troops, to send precisely that message that the Russians need to be protected who are in Ukraine, and also that the Ukrainian government has to be very careful, the new Ukrainian government has to be very careful with how they handle not only the Russian presence, but also how they react to any Russian incursion of their airspace, of their land territory, and of their territorial waters.
Talk to me about the Russian, the Black Sea Fleet. Now, Russia does not have a port on the Mediterranean. It's for hundreds of years has been focused on trying to get a freshwater port somewhere on Russia's periphery, and so they've got one in the Crimea. What's the strategic importance of that?
Well, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has been around since 1783 officially, and it's based in the Crimea. It's based in Sevastopol, and it's designed to safeguard Russia's interests and protect the passage of Russian ships through the Dardanelles, basically the Bosporus going between Istanbul and the Asian continent. That is basically the area that, although it's Turkish, the Russians have a significant interest in keeping that waterway open, and they measure that interest by having the Black Sea Fleet right there, so that if there were ever to be a move to shut the Bosporus down to Russian shipping, they could actually intervene and do so quite decisively.
Let me just ask you a quick question then. What happens if Russia does send in the tanks? Does NATO respond? Does the Ukrainian army fight them? What's the likely outcome?
Well, I think in this particular case, you look at shades of 1956, the Hungarian uprising. You look at 1968, where the Czechoslovak uprising occurred under Alexander Dubček, and the Russian response, or Soviet response at that time, I should say, was very decisive, very lightning war-oriented, and it really set any motion to liberate those countries, or at least make them less within the Soviet orbit, set that back quite a bit. And in fact, it wasn't until 1989 that these countries, as we know, became relatively free of that. So in this particular situation, the Ukraine is a very different matter, because it has been for hundreds of years part of, first of all, the Russian Empire, and then for a very, very brief period after World War I, it became independent, but only nominally so. And
I think what we've got to do then is watch and see what happens just in the next 48 hours, probably.
That's probably true,
Okay.
because you've already seen what they're doing with the airports in the Crimea.
Right, that happened just today. Well, thank you so much, Colonel Cedric Leighton, for a military assessment of what's going on in the Crimea and with the Ukrainian and Russian military. Thank you for joining us. And
My pleasure, KT.
And that's it for DEF CON 3.